I wanted to ask you, do you feel free? Since the ancient times, the questions of possibility of freedom and of the elements that make freedom possible preoccupied thinkers around the world. Traditions as different as Buddhism, Taoism, and all monotheistic religions offered their own approach towards freedom. Philosophers argued about freedom since the time of Aristotle. In political context, the language of freedom is immensely widespread. Whole states, especially in the quote, first world, and many political movements made the concept of freedom central for their identity. Sometimes it takes pretty funny forms. In March 2025, the member of German Green Party Katharina Schulze proposed to implement a 6-month mandatory service for every German citizen from 18 to 67, regardless of gender, calling it Freedom Service. A mandatory freedom service. Another example of a liberal use of a concept of freedom, or should I say illiberal in this case, is US Vice President J.D. Vance criticizing the European states for lack of freedom of speech, while his own Trump administration openly interfered in the matters of American universities, denied White House access to the media who refused to refer to Gulf of Mexico as Gulf of America, and attempted to deport researchers because of their political positions. In these circumstances, when the word freedom is being used as a mere shield by politicians of different sides of political spectrum, while they push for policies that are obviously incompatible with any notion of freedom, it is easy to stop taking the very concept of freedom seriously. I've met some very smart people who, when they hear the very word freedom in the sociopolitical discussion, react either like they've heard a word from a centrist who wants to offer some apologetics for the status quo, or that they are going to hear some manipulative rhetoric that has nothing to do with reality. Today, I want to reflect with you as my companions, to reflect on freedom. Now, it might seem counterintuitive to consult with a person from the dungeon about this, but hey, I chose this dungeon myself. This is a result of my free agency. Before we dive into my own thoughts on freedom, we need to have some working understanding of history of defining liberty. By the way, words liberty and freedom are used interchangeably in the philosophical discussion, so I will freely use them as synonyms. In 1958, a philosopher, Isaiah Berlin, published an article in which he offered the conceptual scheme of freedom that is still relevant in academic discussions despite all the criticisms towards his approach. Berlin suggested that, despite all differences between philosophers throughout the world, all existing conceptualizations of freedom can be grouped as two big ideas. There are two distinct and contradictory ways to define freedom: negative and positive freedom. Negative freedom is a freedom from constraint. Proponents of negative freedom believe that liberty is all about letting a singular human to be whatever one wants to be. A free man is one who thus faces as little limitations from other humans as possible. If you are a proponent of negative freedom, you are not free in one case only: if you can prove that you can do something because other human, group of people, or an institution did something to prevent you from doing what you want to do. Berlin thought that the negative freedom is a relatively new idea in the historical sense. It emerged from the European Renaissance and religious Reformation and is, in Berlin's eyes, most present in the writings of great classics of Anglophone political theory, such as Hobbes, Locke, or John Stuart Mill. Positive freedom is, in Berlin's eyes, a far more ancient idea. While negative freedom is freedom from, the positive liberty is freedom for. There are many possible variants of positive freedom. It might be justified through religion. You enjoy freedom because it is the only way for you to follow the divine's plan through developing your creativity. You might also be a person of positive liberty if you believe that your freedom is necessary just like anyone else's freedom, as an instrument of building an equal and just society. You have freedom because you are a part of community, and the community must live on. According to Berlin, the idea of positive freedom originally emerged from the desire of a person to be one's own master, and not to be a slave of a different man. Berlin thought that when you desire to be your master, you will end up meeting limitations. When you see those, you start to create a contradiction between yourself and an ideal you. When one sees the difference between real humans and ideals, you might end up developing a set of universal rules according to which you should remake humanity. And that is how, according to Berlin, proponents of Freedom 4 become authoritarian. Supposedly, they started to enforce their ideas of what society and state must be upon others and, as a result, build a dictatorship. Berlin's examples of positive freedom thinkers included Plato and his followers, Stoics, Buddhist thinkers, and Hegelians. It is absolutely obvious that Berlin clearly preferred negative freedom. As a classical Anglo-American liberal, Berlin had an almost conservative fear of political projects that aimed to change society, dismissing them as a source of totalitarianism. Of course, since 1958, Berlin's essay got criticized in a million of different strategies. Some criticized Berlin narrowly for his liberal, pun intended, treatment of historical thinkers, who were far more complicated than what Berlin said. Furthermore, none of them referred to themselves as proponents of negative and positive freedom, which presents a problem for those who care deeply about historical authenticity. Another strategy that discussants of Berlin's essay used was to focus on oversimplification that Berlin made. Why should there really be only two possible concepts of freedom? For example, in his famous criticism of Berlin's essay, a major intellectual historian, Quentin Skinner, pointed out that there was, at the very least, a third concept of freedom, what he calls the Neo-Roman idea of freedom. From Skinner's point of view, Neo-Roman thought is contrary to both liberal negative thought and positive Hegelian thought. Unlike both negative and positive freedom thinkers, Neo-Romans did not believe that freedom is determined by the possibility of doing something. Instead, Republicans thought that you stop being a free man and turn into a slave when you end up depending on someone else's will. Myself, I've always found it hard to agree with Berlin's argument. First of all, it's really very hard to agree with his interpretation of attempts to become one's own master. From Berlin's position, it becomes possible to claim that any self-improvement project has an authoritarian tendency, which is impossible to believe even if you do not have a large knowledge of history and simply look at the people around you. Does the visionary architect who has his own style of imagining, drawing, and constructing buildings want to make every single artist in the world conform to his own ideal of doing things? Would, on the other hand, the gym teacher, who obviously has his own ideal, according to which he helps his students to reshape their lives and bodies, want to make everyone in the society live in a healthy way, or maybe build a kind of autocracy with the healthiest person on top, who would guide others? I think that, in most cases, the answer is no. I've seen people who walked the road of self-improvement and walked that path myself, and I did not encounter a wish to become an autocrat from them or from myself. Second, and it is even more important, the entire negative-positive freedom dichotomy simply does not work. Why? Because it is possible to explain freedom without resorting to either of them. And this is ultimately why I decided to make this video. I found out that my own vision of freedom does not fall into the framework constructed by mainstream academic discussion. And, by the way, despite all criticisms, I've seen Berlin's theory being used in discussions during serious university seminars without criticism as an instrument of understanding what freedom is. I think that negative freedom is an inadequate model for understanding of liberty because direct actions performed by other humans, groups, or institutions are a drop of water in the ocean of limitations on human freedom. Many restraints on liberty were not built on purpose. Some of limitations grew naturally and are sustained because of the habit, a social or cultural norm. Many of them are not a product of malicious scheme, an intentional action of limitation of freedom, but merely a byproduct of human coexistence. Furthermore, the very idea of negative liberty as freedom from intervention by others is very shallow. Even when you are perfectly contained within your private sphere, when you are financially independent, the society can still dominate you through all sorts of propaganda, making you desire things you wouldn't have wanted without external encouragement. Now, about positive liberty. I have one thing to say against positive freedom as a model. Berlin's intellectual construction presumes that if you define freedom, then you are trying to justify a specific lifestyle. I will try to show you that it is very possible to define freedom without creating any kind of universal social ideal or hierarchy which one ought to follow. In my opinion, being truly free means being able to be yourself. You should not only be unhindered by the society or absence of resources, but you also need to be able to know the world and yourself so deeply as to be able to define yourself. Freedom is impossible without intellectual and spiritual efforts. I would say that my understanding of freedom can be summarized as freedom as forced aspiration. True freedom, not a shallow illusion of one, is not a thing to be desired, because a path to freedom is extremely painful. It is almost impossible to achieve. Of course, if you achieve it, you are likely going to be happy, but only if you do not lose your mind in the process, or do not stop on one of the steps to achieve freedom. The process of freeing yourself is so painful that you do not really choose to go that path. You have to go for it, because no other options remain. Ironically, a quest to pursue freedom is a result of shackles so heavy that it becomes impossible to tolerate them. I will begin with a small thought experiment, which I use to determine whether or not a person is truly free. First of all, a small disclaimer. According to my own thought experiment, I am not currently a free person. Imagine that you are traveling far away from your current full-time home basement. You are also traveling with someone else. It does not really matter with whom. Imagine that you've come across an object of unique cultural, aesthetic, or ecological value. It might be any object that you may find interesting, but this must be an object that you will need to spend days with. Of course, if you want to fully understand it. Imagine the especially sublime ruins of a castle, or remnants of the ancient city. Maybe a woodland where people recently managed to observe rare species of birds you wanted to see for long. Maybe it is an especially picturesque view that you wish to paint as an artist. You will need to stay at this place for a long time. There is no guarantee that the rare birds will show up when you arrive. In order to fully appreciate the ancient ruin, you would need to gain some background knowledge first. You would need to read some specialized books and walk around it many times. You need to appreciate how the ancient ruin looks like at different hours of the day, for example. Now, answer a question. Can you do it? Can you stay at such a place for a long time? I think that there are 3 levels of freedom. In my story, there are also 3 kinds of roadblocks a person can encounter while thinking about staying. The first and most important level of freedom is an intellectual freedom. To be an intellectually free person means to create a philosophical system of your own and live according to it. If one has no original philosophy, then such a person will not have an internalized and independent hierarchy of needs. In such a case, you won't know your interests. You will have no clue about your own strengths and weaknesses, and your ability to think critically will be hindered because you won't really have your own arguments. A person without one's own system of thought will only bring randomly memorized statements from others into discussion. Beliefs and desires of such a person would be almost completely determined by various authority figures. In my thought experiment, If a tested person failed to imagine an object of unique value which one would like to observe closely, then it is a sign of lack of intellectual freedom. Initially, intellectual freedom is the only level of freedom that can be pursued without big decisions, turning points, and so on. You will free yourself as you develop. The period of intellectual development is also a time when you, in most cases, begin to notice the difference between your position in the world and what you want to be. Then, possibly, you will start to feel pain. If you do, you will achieve the threshold by the time when you've almost understood everything. And then, the explosion might happen. A moment in your life when you feel that you are at the darkest moment possible and that you need some change. The time after the explosion will be the time of sufferings and struggle for a freedom seeker. If one does not suffer, if one was born and raised in a social class and political system that does not create massive problems for an individual, then one will likely stop here. This person will live a comfortable and peaceful life. This one will compromise with the reality, but overall will be happy. This person will stop and will be right. A person who does not suffer will not feel motivated enough to self-discover further. And this person, I cannot stress this enough, will be correct in not going further, because too much pain lies on that path. The second level is resource freedom. This is actually very easy. If one has no money to spare for staying near the object of unique value, then you are not free to deeply contemplate on it. Having enough money does not mean just having enough in a literal sense. It also means being in such a strong balance of your resources and your needs that you are able to do something completely unpractical for sustained periods of time, such as studying books on Bronze Age Crete in order to truly appreciate the ruins of Palace of Knossos. Make no mistake though, a person with money but without original thought would be farther from freedom than a person with philosophy but without money. Imagine a young heir to the massive wealth who spends tremendous amounts of money on premium class cars, clocks, and yachts. This person clearly lacks understanding of his goals and motivations, and is generally dependent on impulses he does not entirely understand. A fashion constructed by producers of premium class goods will always dominate him by luring him into buying another piece of luxury that the heir of a massive wealth wouldn't even value. As a result, he will be far less free than, say, a religious hermit who lives a penniless life in the wasteland with the intention to develop his own understanding of the divine. Resource freedom is also dependent on a philosophical one. Intellectual freedom will bring you a full understanding of yourself, and this also means that you will be able to figure out what you do best. If you do what you do best, you will more likely end up in a situation of having enough to ensure resource freedom. Besides, if you know yourself, you also know your needs. And if you know your needs, you will not need to buy a lot of useless trash. You will buy just enough in order to ensure that your needs are fulfilled. The third and the last level of freedom is a socio-cultural liberty. This is the hardest one. Even if you achieved intellectual and resource freedom, you are still limited by numerous social roles and statuses that you do not choose for yourself. You are, in almost all cases, a citizen of some nation-state by birth. Many other people will hold you accountable for crimes your nation-state committed, historically or recently, even if you were not born during the events or were a child or a teenager. If you are lucky and your nation-state did not commit any crimes recently, your country might still change for the worse from the inside, and you might face the need to comply with the changes of the state policy. If the political development of your home country makes a turn for the worse, chances are you will be presented with a choice of paying taxes to the state that houses a new fascist regime. Said regime might also demand you serve in its army or go through a public service of sorts. Either way, it will attempt to force you to contribute to an immoral political effort. This is something a person of intellectual freedom will never agree with. Gaining socio-cultural freedom in context of your political status means gaining a citizenship somewhere else, through a choice of your own, or maybe creating your own state, or living a simple life in a region so remote that any state would have zero possibility to influence your life. However, socio-cultural liberty is not only about your political status. It is also about your ability to transcend the borders of social norms in order to do obscure things inspired by originality of your thought. In my example story, your ability to stay near the ancient ruin or a uniquely beautiful woodland depends on the ability of your traveling companions to accept your decisions. Your traveling companions must be ready to do some unpractical things, like jerking off on some broken old stones for 2 weeks, reading some obscure books in the process, and possibly drawing paintings. If your companions from my question are like-minded with you and are ready to do unpractical things together, then you are socio-culturally free, at least in that case. If they leave you out of boredom because of the modern culture of tourism prevalent in their heads, a culture that prioritizes making photos of as many cultural or natural objects per trip as possible, and you manage to ignore their request and stay near the unique object, then you are socio-culturally free as well. If, however, you have decided to follow the normal pattern of tourism instead of what you wanted, then you are not free socio-culturally, no matter how good of an autistic thinker you are, no matter how much money you have. When the extrovert girlfriend attempts to goad the introvert guy into going somewhere during the time when the guy typically has a strategy gaming session and succeeds, then the introvert guy clearly did not achieve sociocultural freedom. One of the most important things to keep in mind is that complete sociopolitical freedom is impossible. Therefore, total freedom is impossible. If you are a part of any group at all, then you are a part of its politics. If this is a group where you are the person with most freedom, for example, you are a cult founder, then you still have obligations as a cult leader. If you try to neglect your role as a cult leader, your cult might fall apart, and then your level of freedom will backslide because you clearly relied on that cult to achieve your resource freedom. There is no escaping politics. And that is why you will never be completely free socio-politically, no matter how long and hard you suffer to get into even touching the problems of socio-political freedom. If you try evading politics by living alone, like a hermit in a wasteland where no one can find you, then you will likely never achieve resource freedom. The survival will occupy all of your time. To be free in terms of resources while living in a remote region, you will still need to have a group of pawns, a group of people with you. This group will have politics, so there will be no complete sociopolitical freedom there. Still, if this group of reclusive people is composed of spiritually aligned people, they might get almost to the top of this pyramid. Still, if a freedom seeker is lucky enough to even consider thinking about problems of sociopolitical freedom, this freedom seeker has achieved an intellectual and resource freedom. This person is basically a part of the absolute minority of those who succeeded in the climb. If this person will manage to solve at least some problems of a sociopolitical status, this freedom seeker will have the ability to feel happiness, because most of his problems will be solved. Now, this theory of what freedom is might sound like liberty is something almost impossible to achieve. And I would now to return to what I said before. Not only it is almost impossible to achieve, but the path to freedom might be harmful for a human being, and it is also unnecessary. According to my observations, people who walk the road of achieving freedom are usually those who did not have the option to rely on institutions, family, or the state. For the entirety of history, relying on some of these was the core reason of absence of freedom on one hand and simultaneously of human happiness. In pre-industrial societies, the institutions of education available for the majority of population were extremely limited. In this situation, the extended family was the main source of knowledge about the world and the key mean to survival. It meant, most likely, that you would learn the trade of your family and practice it for your whole life. This prevented the working classes of pre-modern societies, farmers and craftsmen, from making any steps in direction of freedom, intellectual or otherwise. For the elite minority, the aristocrats, the obligation of military service as knights, officers, and landowners locked most of them into a specific mentality which left little space for intellectual development and, consequently, freedom. Among the aristocrats, there was an even smaller elite minority of those nobles who lived during the periods of absence of military obligation for nobles. Historically, some of them managed to become thinkers and patrons, free from the standpoint of intellect and resources, but almost all failed to become free socioculturally. Even those nobles who were freed from warrior's path still had to obey to the idea of dynastic legacy, to the idea of noble blood purity, to the noble beliefs of labor and behavior fit or unfit, and to the limiting and suffocating etiquette. The priests, who were responsible for creating the most knowledge in pre-industrial societies, were mostly busy preserving traditions and canons of their faiths, which meant that the majority of clergy had no option of achieving freedom. Absence of dominant, institutionalized religion would be a source of enormous suffering for the majority of representatives of this class. However, some of the clergy had unique opportunities at becoming free, through developing their own visions of the faith and living according to them together with their followers. So, the minority of clergy arguably had the best opportunities for achieving freedom in the agrarian societies, provided, of course, they survived the intense theological discussions which might or might not involve fire. The numerically small trader class was in a situation close to that of the priests. On one hand, the majority of traders were busy working on relatively easy and boring trade routes, like selling sheep wool from the village to the weavers in a local town. On the other hand, however, in pre-industrial era, there were always high-risk trade routes for sought-after goods. A failed expedition to the distant lands might have ended with you killed or enslaved. However, if succeeded, it would bring you a massive fortune. Even more important, high-risk trade missions of the pre-industrial era often meant contact with cultures unknown or almost unknown in your homeland. This is crucial because long-range traders found themselves at the forefront of production of knowledge about terra incognita. So, the minority of traders, like the minority of clergy, had good chances at achieving freedom. There is one thing that is clear now. Since the ancient times, freedom existed in the gray zone, in the space of risk, between political units and institutions. In a community built by a spiritual leader or aboard the trading ship, the religious canon and opinions of kings, guilds, and nobles did not matter. Places where the new could be discovered, places where you can pay the highest, ultimate price possible for failure. If you live a normal life surrounded by your friends, family, a certain set of rules, formal or informal, you would likely be much more safe, despite never being free. Pursuing freedom means going against the accepted social norms, and it also means the conflict with the interests of your family, and it will also cause a disruption in your relationship with your friends. Trying to become free means pursuing a mirage of sorts and risking your life in a space of risk. In a way, you also put yourself into a disadvantage by trying to become free. You will no longer have the option of existing in the cultural and professional world that you knew how to navigate because of your long-time experience. Now you will have to do something new, to put yourself into situations you never experienced. This is a law of dangers of freedom seeking that never changed throughout history. However, history brought some other important changes. The industrial and post-industrial society came with several important novelties concerning freedom. On one hand, it became technically easier for people to develop their ideas and, consequently, to achieve intellectual freedom. The reason for that is growing availability of education and ease of access to information. On the other hand, however, the state grew strong. For some, the state started to replace family and institutions. For the first time in history, the modernity made it possible for some to rely on state pensions instead of support of your family. Some intellectuals who previously relied on the church and autonomous institutions of education, such as medieval universities, now work in the institutions of research and education that are under control of the state. The modern states, armed with the new technologies of communication and transportation, significantly decreased the terra incognita of the world. No trading business nowadays involves the contact with the new and other, because the entirety of the world is known. Practically all of the earth is occupied by the states. The state knows very well what happens inside its borders, and going to some wasteland is likely not an option to hide from its attention. Every piece of land is within the sphere of interests of some corrupt national hereditary elite. Despite the growing access to education, the state controls its contents, so becoming intellectually free is still hard. The risky space between the worlds of states, institutions, and families shrinks, and with it, the freedom becomes harder to attain. The good side of this process is that if you fail on one of the steps to your liberation, you are less likely to pay the ultimate price for failure, in comparison to pre-industrial world. Indeed, you will likely not be killed or enslaved for small braveries that are available for us when we take action to begin freeing ourselves in terms of resources, such as escaping your aggressively conservative hometown or family, leaving your exploitative full-time job to prioritize your favorite side hustle, or leaving your country for turning into a dictatorship. Of course, it is still possible that you will fail in your projects and die from hunger as a result of inability to earn money, but at least you are less likely to be killed on the street. Furthermore, if you do not die as a result of your failure, you can try again and fight another day. The downside of the economic and technological expansion of the states and humanity overall is the increase in competition, and competition usually means less opportunities to achieve freedom. Competition means that effective ways of attaining resource freedom are concentrated in few, highly technical subjects, which humans are not likely to enjoy. You can achieve intellectual independence in the modern world easier in comparison to previous eras in human history, but going further might be a complete roadblock, because your skill set and preferences might lock you out of arbitrary demands of a highly specialized late capitalist economy. Overall, I think that these processes even each other out, and it is neither easier nor more difficult to achieve freedom in the modern, post-industrial society than it was in pre-industrial era. However, you can clearly see that despite all the historical changes, every big change in your life is a risk factor, and it is especially true if you want to pursue freedom. Most people I know who embarked on a journey to become free did not start going this road by making a rational decision to change their lives. This journey usually begins with a massive emotional explosion in the darkest hour of your life. You live, then you experience a massive stress in your daily life, and one day you know that you can't take it anymore. One day you stand near the window in the dark room and say to yourself, "I will change something or I will die." You do not decide to live the social world you knew and understood because of a mere whim. Such decisions are usually a result of severe suffering. This explains the social composition of groups who usually seek freedom. Most of the liberty seekers I've encountered were the descendants of families with unclear social status, with no clear generational career, and/or without substantial generational wealth. Quite a lot of people who are freedom seekers come from educated but little to no assets situations. A lot of people among freedom seekers are political immigrants from dictatorships who got so sick of tyranny back at home that they've had to abandon their whole old life. Another important group who are often freedom seekers are introverts with niche interests who tend to be shunned even by societies of their own home countries. The people I've listed are certainly not the only ones who desire freedom, but these are the ones I've mostly encountered. Many roads are open to them, and yet nowhere they are truly welcome, even if they go to countries that are considered the most free places in the world, according to the respected metrics like the one by Freedom House. And here we stumble upon a very important and interesting subject. What about liberal democratic states that at least try to build and maintain a free society? Surely you can be free there. I'll answer. In general, free people exist. Cliques, clubs, and associations of free people might exist. Free societies, like cities and nations, cannot exist. There is no such thing as a free society, and there never will be. If we all agree that freedom is impossible without an intellectual development of some sorts, and this is something that even the most profound supporters of negative freedom will agree with, then the capacity to think originally and critically is a foundation of liberty. The state, however, can be organized around thousands, tens of thousands, or millions of original thinkers. The state either succeeds at keeping a specific ideology at its core, or the original ideology will slowly degrade into a technocratic, cynical swamp without real principles. Both of these variants are not free states, and both are at risk of turning into a worse, tyrannical version. In the state organized around an ideology at its core, no one is guaranteed freedom, with the exception of a high council of autistic nerds who wrote the ideology. This is, of course, if the nerds get lucky and they are not overthrown and killed by power-hungry realist who then builds his personal tyranny, which is a normal historical scenario. In a state built by ideological nerds, no one would be free, with the exception of original nerdy ideologists, because in such a state, everyone else is a follower and has to revere teachings of the past and turn them into a canon. It is quite likely that in such a state, people would have to march like lambs to the slaughter to die in the war to protect the teachings of the ancient wise men, explaining their compliance with concepts such as duty and loyalty. Freedom, intellectual or otherwise, becomes more and more unavailable in this scenario. If a relatively pragmatic, power-hungry leader will emerge and destroy the rule of nerd ideologists during its early years, then the situation will be even worse. A late ideological dictator will form the canon even more aggressively and will build a massive machine of political repressions, and will be even more likely to wage aggressive wars on a huge scale. In the end, millions will die because of late ideological dictators' rule. As you can see, any form of state built around a single ideology will heavily limit freedom-seeking, or even make it impossible. The second option is a descent into a pragmatic technocratic swamp, results in a place where no one was ever guaranteed the freedom at all, even without the nerds, because such a state is a result of a long history of smelly compromises between various elite groups. These groups of elites were not motivated by their thoughts and ideas. They were simply afraid that their families, status, and assets would be destroyed in a war of all against all. This is why they composed a compromise after compromise in order to keep power and wealth for themselves, while installing a set of rules to resolve disputes and throwing some handouts to general population to keep the masses in line. They control education and media, creating a roadblock for an intellectual freedom, and they control wealth, limiting the possibilities for achieving the resource freedom. However, since the pragmatic elite groups never had any coherent vision of the future, they are doomed to fail in their attempts to build a balance. The states built by compromise are doomed to be fragile. One day, a prominent oligarch will rise and make an attempt to become the tyrant, in an attempt to build a horrible regime, a pragmatic tyranny without solid ideological foundation. As you can see, neither option provides freedom for its participants. Therefore, no state can be called an instrument of building a free society. The Western liberal democracies in their current version are on the border between pragmatic technocracy and doom spiraling into pragmatic tyranny. In 2025, the centrist liberal discourse has largely abandoned its ideological values of human rights and rule-based international order. They have largely adopted the language of strength used by pragmatic tyrants and wannabe pragmatic tyrants. The people who live in liberal democracies are living through a worrisome time when the political system that never cared much for freedom in the first place is at great risk of being replaced with the system that would actually be anti-freedom. Make no mistake, however, if you have to pursue freedom, the liberal democratic countries are still much better than anything else in the world, because they generally provide better opportunities for developing an intellectual freedom by not being hostile to it. Well, I guess that's it. We have discussed everything there is to discuss about freedom. Please reflect one more time after you've heard all of this. Do you feel that you are free? Do you still want to be free? Or do you feel that you have no choice? Does my theory reflect your life experiences? Or did I miss something about the nature of freedom and freedom seeking that you might add? Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments section. Subscribe and we will meet soon, here in the Videological Dungeon.